Oh my goodness, is that the time already? My apologies. I was just immersed in some excellent literature. Hello, my name is Professor John Gillette, expert in marking and quality assurance. Before I begin my outstanding presentation today, I just wanted to say my group members, my peers are Taryn, Mark, and Lavanya. The learning area in which we mark the student response, Tony, was physics. And as for the purpose of the video, well, we're going to get into that right now, just as I share my screen. Okay, the purpose of the video today is my extensive review of the marking and quality assurance process. Again, my name is Professor John Gillette. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to report to you what my peers and I, who I mentioned, did to mark this assignment. So here you can see us all deep in thought in the pre-calibration meeting. And basically what occurred here was we got together to look at the ISMG, or the instrument specific marking guide. And we went through the language that was in there, the cognitive verbs and the definitions of those verbs. Some reconstruction early. In future, I think we should look at the annotated examples that QCAA provide, because I think this would give a much clearer understanding of what is needed for a high and a mid-level sample. As we're going to see, there were some very initial disparities in the marks. So before I get into that, what we did is we went away, shut off from the whole world, but not really, and we marked Tony's assessment individually. And then we came together for this quality assurance meeting, this moderation meeting. And the first thing we did was we told each other what we gave the mark. Let's see how that went.
Okay, so I gave 16 out of 20. You got 18? 17?
11.
Yeah, I'm close to the mark. I really want to give 10 or 11 to pass, but I could also see myself giving 8.
Cool, so that means we've got lots to talk about, which is actually a really good thing.
Lots to talk about indeed, Taryn. As you can see, some big disparities initially. So as you can imagine, this led to lots of discussion. Sometimes we weren't always in agreement, but a technique we used, we came back to the ISMG and the cognitive verbs and the definitions of those cognitive verbs. And this allowed us to see what range, 5 to 6, 3 to 4, 1 to 2, was most appropriate given the student response. Let's take a look again.
Which means knowledgeable, learned, having relevant knowledge, being conversant with the topic based on an understanding of the facts of the situation, and adequate means satisfactory or acceptable in quality and quantity equal to the requirement or occasion.
So this really helped us clarify some confusion and disagreements, differing of opinions we had. Now, I don't want you to think that all we did was just disagree and argue. So towards the end of the meeting, here's some agreement that happened.
And then do we think that there's a reasonable description of reliability and validity as opposed to justified?
I thought it was reasonable. I don't think it was justified.
I'm with Mark on this one.
So look at that, some professional growth and agreement. So all told, it took me an hour to mark Tony's assessment individually. And then this quality assurance or moderation meeting took roughly an hour. So that's 2 hours to mark this assignment. And at the end of the day, we settled, thankfully, we all came to the conclusion that 12 out of 20 was the appropriate mark for this assessment. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to relate this to now what I saw happening in schools. You might be thinking, what? Schools, real life, in a real life context? That's not what university is about. I know. Bear with me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some similarities and differences and then talk through the implications of those differences. So some similarities, peer collaboration, as we can see here, disagreements, respectful discussions. Importantly, a strong content knowledge of both physics and the QCAA processes. It can take quite a long time. It took me 2 hours for one assessment, and that is not uncommon. And For this peer collaboration, teachers or markers would bring marked student responses to these meetings. So some differences. So pre-collaboration did not looking at high or mid-level samples. Two teachers at the school I was placed at rather than the 4 that you saw there. At my placement school, the head of department independently looked at assessment by going through the ISMG, looking at the words, the cognitive verbs, and things like that, and then matching up what he thought, in this case, that he was appropriate. He also had the final say if a consensus could not be reached. Thankfully, we did have a consensus. We did not send off Tony's assessment or response for confirmation, and sometimes schools will do quality assurance with other schools in the region. So implication, just so you can see, implication of these differences, and there I am again. Okay, so the high and mid-level annotated examples provided by QCAA would have provided a greater insight. As we saw, some very high, some very low marks initially when we marked it by ourselves. I think this would have been of great clarification. With no head of department, differences of opinion can be hard to settle. Thankfully, we all came to the consensus of 12. And of course, as moving on, continuing on from this, the head of department had the final say on the mark at the school. This extends further to QCAA process, as obviously we did not send Tony's assessment off for confirmation, which means in a cynical sense, we could have given him 14 out of 20 with no repercussions. So the quality assurance we can see here is very good for accountability. And finally, moderating with other schools, particularly in rural regions, can be a useful option for another set of eyes, sharing resources, and seeing that there's some consistency across schools and across regions. So now we're going to look at some reason relating it back to the literature, because we all know that is very important. And what does the literature say as to why quality assurance is so important? Well, first off, the whole point of it is to gain consistency among students, schools, and regions. And this is a strength, in my opinion, of the quality assurance processes of endorsement, where schools have to send their planned assessment away to be endorsed or given the green tick of approval. Yes, this is a fair assessment for students to do. And then confirmation, where students do the assessment, their marks, their internal marks are sent away to QCAA, who look at it and say, yes, this is fair, this is an appropriate mark for the level of work. So Harlan in 2005 found that students' ability and or behavior in the classroom can really affect teachers' judgment of performance, or bias is another word for that. In an ideal world, this wouldn't happen, but you know, we've all been in a school at this point. Certainly we can see that some students would be can give you a hard time, basically. So I think this quality assurance helps keep teachers fair and accountable. Also, I think Black et al. Found that it gives teachers greater understanding of how they can best help prepare students to succeed, both for the assessment using backwards mapping as one technique, and also later in life. And also, as Maxwell found, it strengthens the professional capacity of teachers. So reflecting, and I'll just show you reconstructing as I minimize me. Reconstructing, the pre-calibration in future, I think should include discussion of the process, which we did. Ground rules such as being respectful should also be set. I thought this was actually self-explanatory, but having seen it in a practical sense, definitely this is not self-explanatory. These ground rules should absolutely be set. The most important difference that I found was looking at the annotated examples that I've already talked about during this pre-calibration meeting. I think gives a great clarification to teachers and to markers, so they can see what is a high level response, what is mid, and by extension, what is a low level response. And going on from Harlan's findings, in cases where there's more than one class, marking some assessment from the other class or other classes, I think would be a great tool to remove the bias, any potential bias, I should say, of students in the class. And here are some references. And I'm going to stop sharing because that is the end of my presentation. Are there any questions from those of you watching?